This video is an introduction to what we call the core executive. And as the diagram shows there, and you can find it on page 67 of the textbook, we are not just talking about the Prime Minister and the senior members of Cabinet. We are also talking about Cabinet committees, which are subdivisions of Cabinet, top civil servants who are politically neutral. They tend to remain in post when governments come and go, and the Cabinet Office as well. And when we're talking about all of these groups and the so-called core executive, we're talking about where and how government policy is made. So the four key roles of the core executive. First of all, make policy. The executive decides on policy, and then the civil service is the institution in charge of delivering it and implementing it on the day-to-day basis. Secondly, passing legislation. So the acts that make their way through Parliament don't begin in Parliament, they are discussed and approved by Cabinet before being sent there. So an example would be the Coronavirus Act of 2020. That policy was made by senior government officials, discussed in Cabinet, and we'll talk about Cobra meetings in a moment, and then passed through the House of Commons before becoming law. The third role is financing, and that's a particular job for the Chancellor and the Treasury. They set taxation and levels of government spending in an annual spring budget. And there you can see Rishi Sunak in the spring budget of 2022. And then finally, the core executive is the national first responder. The core executive is expected to act quickly and efficiently to bring in emergency measures, emergency policy, and reassure the public at times of crisis. So an example is the so-called Cobra meetings. And you can see the Cobra meeting room pictured there. Now, we think that we get this name from the Cabinet Office briefing rooms, but when we talk about a Cobra meeting, we're talking about the Civil Contingencies Committee. So potential crises are dealt with in Cobra meetings. You might know that in April 2020, it emerged. Michael Gove spoke in the press and to confirm that Boris Johnson missed the first 5 Cobra meetings held concerning the coronavirus pandemic prior to the first cases being confirmed in the United Kingdom. So, the main powers of the core executive. This is the executive as a group. We'll talk about individual responsibilities for the Prime Minister later. But we've got patronage, civil service, international relations and emergencies. And on the next few slides, I'll explain each of those separate powers. So, many of the powers of the executive derive from the royal prerogative, things that the monarch historically had responsibility for. The first is patronage, the hiring and firing of government ministers. And quite often this comes in the form of cabinet reshuffles. Now, Rishi Sunak, in his role as Prime Minister, had his first reshuffle in February 2023. And this is the chance for a Prime Minister to bring in cabinet ministers of their choosing. There are some limitations which we'll discuss later, but let's have a look at some of the big names coming in and out of cabinet. So, Jeremy Hunt was very briefly Chancellor prior to Liz Truss's resignation. Before Liz Truss resigned, responsibility for the disastrous so-called mini-budget fell on the then Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. And although Liz Truss, even after losing her role, said that she supported Kwasi Kwarteng's decision-making, he was initially held responsible for the crash in the British market after the announcement of the mini-budget. So Jeremy Hunt, for a very brief time, was Chancellor to Liz Truss. Then Liz Truss retired. Rishi Sunak decided to keep Jeremy Hunt in place as Chancellor, as Prime Minister. And it says there on the Sky News analysis, keeping him could be an attempt to reassure the markets. Now, Jeremy Hunt is seen more towards the centre of the Conservative Party. He doesn't have very many friends on the Boris Johnson wing of the party, more towards the Conservative right. And so that brought it with it some grumbles from Conservative supporters. And another controversial reappointment was Suella Braverman. Suella Braverman quit 6 days before being reappointed to the role of Home Secretary. Now remember that she resigned after she was found guilty of breaching the ministerial code. She sent classified documents from a personal email address. That is a breach of the ministerial code because it is a national security threat, because personal email addresses are far easier to hack than secure networks. But she was out of a job for 6 days before Rishi Sunak brought her back in, and that was a controversial move. However, Suella Braverman, again on the Conservative Party right, is a popular character, particularly her policy, her standing on immigration policy. So what we can see with those, the people that have been brought into cabinet, is on the one hand, Rishi Sunak is trying to keep the wings of the party happy in the centre, but then also to the right wing of the party too, by bringing Suella Braverman back. And then ministers who left. Jacob Rees-Mogg actually resigned prior to the reshuffle. He'd served as leader of the House of Commons under Boris Johnson. He'd been a business secretary under Liz Truss. But he resigned prior to the reshuffle, but would have been expected to leave his position anyway. And then another minister who lost their job, they didn't resign, this time they were removed from position, was a Liz Truss loyalist, Chloe Smith. She was Work and Pension Secretary and she was replaced. So, next up, the executive is in charge of, particularly the Prime Minister in this case, deploying the British Armed Forces overseas, but also international relations generally. And one area of international relations that dominated Boris Johnson's later months of his time as Prime Minister were his telephone conversations and then eventual meeting with President Vladimir Zelensky in April 2022, when Boris Johnson travelled to Kyiv to commit to Britain's support for the Ukrainians fighting the invasion of their territory. On top of this, the Prime Minister is also in charge of making and ratifying treaties with other nations. So when it comes to international relations, the only branch of government that should or needs to play a formal role is the executive. But later on, we'll discuss how, in recent years, Parliament has had a say. The executive, or the Prime Minister in this case, is also in charge of the organisation and structure of the civil service. And as I said before, civil servants are employed by the government, but they are politically neutral. They tend to stay in post when governments change. So whereas a cabinet minister like Suella Braverman is a Conservative MP, civil servants are experts in an area of policy. And as I said, they tend to stay in post when government ministers leave, because one thing that can happen in cabinet is in reshuffles somebody could go from being an education secretary to work in pensions to defence, and they don't have the level of expertise, and that's where senior civil servants step in. But in recent years we've also seen the growth of so-called SPADs, special advisors. These really grew in the Cameron years. You can see a slight drop during Theresa May's premiership. However, under Boris Johnson and later Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, the number of special advisors rose significantly. So as of 2022, there were 126 individuals who we could call SPADs. And the most famous SPAD of recent times is Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings was the chief advisor to Boris Johnson for some time when he was Prime Minister, but later left that role. And what was interesting about Dominic Cummings is he himself was a SPAD, a special advisor, but his job, his role, was to encourage people to become special advisors to the British government. And so he, from his blog, advertised for people to send their CV in. And the Conservative Party in 2020 created a website that was encouraging people to apply to become a special advisor. Now, that caused some disruption because there is a political party advertising for people to take government roles. And so Sir Mark Sedwill had to come out to say that the website was run and paid entirely by the Conservative Party and would not be an automatic government process. You might remember Dominic Cummings as the famous example of a SPAD because of the Rose Garden speech that he gave. You can see him sat there at Downing Street. So in May 2020, Dominic Cummings gave a speech in the Rose Garden of Downing Street to explain his actions, because in March of the same year, he was found to have travelled from his home in London to Barnard Castle, which is up in the very north of England. Which I believe his wife had tested positive for coronavirus. One thing that he used as an explanation in the Rose Garden speech is that drive would have been an opportunity for him to test his eyesight, such a long drive from London right up into the north of England. But he attempted to explain why breaking coronavirus laws was a reasonable behaviour. He used the phrase, "I think I behaved reasonably." Now, at the time, the country was up in arms that the Prime Minister wasn't going to remove this SPAD from his role for breaking coronavirus rules. But what the country later learned is that several parties in Downing Street had already taken place, and coronavirus lockdown laws had already been broken. And many later argued that Dominic Cummings was kept in post because simply he knew too much, and he had all the information that could have brought down Boris Johnson's government. Now, those stories, those revelations came out anyway, and a fallout reportedly between Cummings and Boris Johnson's wife, Carrie, meant that eventually Dominic Cummings did leave his role. And the final one is emergencies and national crisis. Now, the executive is expected to report to the public, and you might remember the coronavirus briefings, but although Boris Johnson was present at each one, there were other key individuals there, such as Health Secretary at the time, Matt Hancock. It also included Professor Chris Whitty, who was Chief Medical Officer for England, so he was the Chief Medical Advisor to the UK government at the time, and Professor Jonathan Van Tam, who was Deputy Chief Medical Officer. So although Boris Johnson is pictured there, other members of the core executive, Matt Hancock, Chris Whitty and Jonathan Van Tam, were also present to regularly report back to the people of the United Kingdom on the coronavirus pandemic. There are other powers and roles that are designed or reserved especially for the Prime Minister. Not the core executive generally. So we talked before about in the last video about the Prime Minister being primus inter pares, meaning that the Prime Minister is the leader of cabinet, and linked to that he is expected, or they are expected, to lead government and chair cabinet meetings. But in the role of primus inter pares, the Prime Minister is also expected to be the defender of government policy. You wouldn't expect a Prime Minister to attack policy that has been outlined by the Health Minister, for example. As well as leading government and cabinet and chairing those cabinet meetings, the Prime Minister is, of course, expected to lead their party in the House of Commons as well. The Prime Minister is also the monarch's first minister and is expected to report regularly back to the monarch. And you may remember famously the first of the weekly meetings between Liz Truss and King Charles III. And King Charles III was recorded as saying, "Back again, oh dear," when Liz Truss arrived. Now, that was supposed to be the first of what Liz Truss hoped to be many weekly meetings with the monarch. That was on the 12th of October, when Liz Truss was under significant pressure herself to resign, which is why Charles muttered, "Back again, dear oh dear." Just 8 days later, Liz Truss resigned on the 20th of October. And finally, the Prime Minister is expected to have a strong media profile. And quite often that involves television and newspaper media, but we've also seen in recent years Prime Ministers attempting to use social media. Now, that can get Prime Ministers in trouble, like Rishi Sunak, who can here be seen travelling in a motorcar in Blackpool and without using a seatbelt, and he received a fixed penalty notice from Lancashire Police for not wearing his seatbelt. That is the second time he has been charged, because as Chancellor he was issued with a fixed penalty notice for attending the Downing Street parties which broke coronavirus lockdown rules. Okay, so this is just to summarise. We've looked at the powers of the executive. I'm going to look at the two arguments that suggest that the executive is and is not significantly powerful. So the first argument that's made in the table, which you can actually find in your textbook on pages 68 to 69. The first argument that is made is surrounding the armed forces. The Prime Minister and the executive, the government is not expected and not formally required to seek parliamentary approval. However, you can see on the other side of the table that all recent military action has involved Parliament. So that goes back to the Gulf Wars of the 90s and then in the early 2000s, but then also airstrikes on Syria and Iraq. So you could look at this two ways. Officially, the government does not need to seek the advice of Parliament, and therefore is powerful and significant. However, in reality, Parliament is called upon for their opinion. And then next up is patronage powers. Prime Ministers have unlimited choice over who joins and leaves their government and can host as many reshuffles as they see fit. Now, to constantly reshuffle is not a good idea, because you will lose the trust and the loyalty of your fellow politicians. You may make yourself some political enemies, and it could lead to just poor government, a lack of consistency. Now, in theory, there's no requirement to there's no requirement to submit these nominations, and actually the Prime Minister doesn't have to just get MPs. The Prime Minister can also call upon members of the House of Lords. Now, this was the case with Lord Zach Goldsmith. Now, he lost a by-election to the Liberal Democrats, which meant that he was no longer an MP, and he lost his role as a sitting member of Cabinet. Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, elevated him to the House of Lords with a life peerage and brought him back into Cabinet. So that is a way that the Prime Minister can have significant power. They can have choice over life peerages into the House of Lords, and then bring these people like Lord Goldsmith into Cabinet. However, there is practical constraints. That sometimes there are popular party figures that it would be unwise of the Prime Minister to ignore. So Rishi Sunak will have been under pressure to have these young and ascendant members of the Conservative right wing in his cabinet. So I'm thinking of individuals like Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman, individuals who were rivals to Rishi Sunak and to Liz Truss for the leadership of the party prior to Liz Truss's eventual victory. And so there are practical concerns. So Rishi Sunak, he may personally not wish to be working with challengers like Kemi Badenoch or Suella Braverman, but in reality it's better to have people on side in an attempt to bring the party together. It doesn't always work. I mean, Theresa May is an example of a Prime Minister who he had Boris Johnson serve as Foreign Secretary. Now, eventually Boris Johnson was removed from that role because he proved to be an awkward member of cabinet for Theresa May, and quite openly a challenger to her authority. So he didn't serve for very long, but bringing Boris Johnson in was an attempt to curb his influence on the factions on the right wing of the Conservative Party. Didn't work as she expected in the end. Okay, let's look at the next argument, the third argument for significance. The Prime Minister is the figurehead in times of national crisis, the broadcasts, speeches and messages, and we saw that during the coronavirus pandemic, and that elevated Boris Johnson's stature and soft power, as we call it. However, one thing that we could say is that the executive is only as strong as Parliament allows it to be, and we can see that in the third argument on the less significant side of things. One thing that made Boris Johnson so powerful was after the 2019 election, the Conservatives had an 80-seat majority. And that gives the Prime Minister more power to pass legislation in the House of Commons than compared with, let's say, Theresa May, who had a minority Conservative government being propped up by the DUP. And then a final argument, these are the two arguments you can find on page 69. Significant that the executive plays a crucial part in negotiating treaties and agreements with other nations in areas such as trade, and Liz Truss was keen as Prime Minister to boast her achievements in arranging trade deals with countries outside of the European Union. But then finally, and this is a synoptic link to our work on the judiciary, one area in which the prerogative powers are limited is that the Supreme Court has a role in identifying what is the responsibility of the executive and what is not. I'm thinking in particular here about Miller 1, the case where the Supreme Court unanimously decided that the triggering of Article 50 was the role of Parliament, not of the executive. And there the Supreme Court is deciding that parliamentary sovereignty is to be upheld and the prerogative powers cannot be used in that sense. So, to summarise, formally, the Prime Minister and the role of Prime Minister is an incredibly powerful position, but practicalities can dictate how powerful a Prime Minister may or may not be.